Our next witness, as you will have gathered from her description this morning as Ms. K, is anonymous. And so in her case, as in the case of other witnesses whose identity must not be disclosed by anyone, I shall make a restriction order. And as with every other case in which I have done this, I shall read it out. My apologies if some of it sounds legalistic, but it has to be effective. And so it reads as follows. The name and address of witness W2643, that's Miss K, to you and me, and any other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of their appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form, unless express permission is given by me or the solicitor to the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness W2643 must be referred to only as Ms. K. The order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered, and I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. Those of you who followed the proceedings in Belfast will know that in one particular case there, indeed, I did so at the witness's own request. That order means what it says. The press have a copy, so please take care in taking any photographs, if you do, mobile phones or whatever, around this building, to make sure you do not include any photograph of her without her prior consent. Miss K.
Known to the inquiry. Please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Ms. Kay, you're here to talk to the inquiry about your father, who we obviously won't name, and the impact on him and on your mother and on you of his infection with HIV.
Yes.
Your dad had severe haemophilia A.
Yes.
And how did that affect him generally?
He used Vectorate a lot. At the point that I started school, he had been pretty much wrapped up in cotton wool, and sort of the family as a whole had tried to keep him away from sports and any activities where he might injure himself. He wore a brace on his leg because he'd had an accident. I believe it was in a cricket match when he was at prep school, and due to a bleed in his leg, the lower half of his leg had got quite badly withered, and it's one of the first things I remember about my dad, actually.
And you've said in your statement his condition wasn't particularly stable, and he did suffer a number of bleeds.
He did, and sometimes it was quite difficult because when somebody you care about has a condition that's not particularly stable and they can get very unwell at short notice and be extremely uncomfortable, you try and predict when it's going to happen, and you're constantly rushing around. So if he sort of bashed his leg on a table, I would completely freak out and just sort of be ready to help and just sort of worry that something bad was going to happen all the time.
Now, he was under the care of the Oxford Haemophilia Centre for quite a long period of time.
Yes.
And your understanding is that he he received Factor 8 whilst he was there.
Yes.
And what you've said in your statement is that you were, as a family, led to understand that he was given Factor 8 from the United Kingdom.
Yes, we were always told it was Scottish Factor 8.
But then a point came in the 1980s, mid-1980s or early 1980s, when he moved to the care of St Thomas's.
Yes. My dad had worked for my dad left the company and went to work.
So he moved to London and he was under the care at St Thomas's of Mr Savage.
Yeah, because he was working in London. We were still living outside London at the time in Oxfordshire, but he was working in London, so it was much easier to receive care near work.
And your understanding, again, the family's understanding was that at St Thomas's he was receiving imported unheat-treated Factor 8.
Yes.
Now, you haven't yet been able to get hold of your dad's medical records.
No.
I know you're trying to and may want to draw them to the inquiry's attention if you do. Is this right then? The evidence you're giving is based upon your understanding and recollection of discussions and conversations within the family home?
Some of it's based on what I saw when I was at various hospitals with my dad. Some of it's based on my recollections of those, and some of it is what I was told by Mum and Dad.
And during the years with which we're most concerned at present in the 1980s, you were in fact a teenager.
Yes.
And you used to help care for both your dad and your mum, who had her own health difficulties at the time.
Yes.
And your parents were quite open with you about the medical treatment that your dad was receiving?
Yes, they were. I used to inject my dad with Factor 8, and it was just a normal part of daily life because my mum was also disabled and sometimes also needed help. She was in a wheelchair, so she needed quite a lot of assistance. So it was just something that was normal. It was the only family I'd grown up in, so I didn't know anything else.
And you were quite young, I think, when you started to help your dad with receiving the Factor 8.
Yes, I was just short of 5.
Now, how and when did your dad find out that he had been infected with HIV?
My dad had read a lot of the newspaper stories about HIV and AIDS, and he contacted the hospital regarding getting a test. And what he told me afterwards was that when he went for the test, that he was told that he had already been tested and he was positive. And sorry, do you mind if I refer to my statement for dates?
Of course not, okay, absolutely. You deal with this in your witness statement at paragraphs 7, 8 and 9.
Yeah. That's what I thought. I still can't remember the exact date. It's not something that's come back to me. He did find out in 1986. And, it was around 2 years, maybe slightly over 2 years, that they'd known, because my dad gave blood regularly on request of the Haemophilia Centre because they were trying to find a cure for haemophilia, and he wanted to help with that.
So when he went to St Thomas's in 1986, concerned about what he'd read and asking to be tested, that was the point at which he was told that there was already a test effectively on his records that was a positive test from about 2 years previously.
Yes.
And he hadn't been told that.
He hadn't been told. He was very upset at the time. He was told that it was some sort of an admin or clerical error, and everybody seemed to be very sorry about it. But obviously it was very upsetting because he was concerned that he might have infected my mum.
Presumably, from what you say, he wasn't even aware that he had been tested some 2 years previously.
No. He had specifically given blood on a regular basis for them to find further treatments and cures for haemophilia. Nobody ever mentioned that he was being tested for anything else, as far as I'm aware.
As far as you know, was your dad provided with any information or advice at any time when he was being given factor 8 about any risk of infection?
There was no general information, anything about HIV or HTLV or anything like that. My dad did actually have hepatitis B twice. I remember it firstly when I was very young, he just turned bright yellow for a number of months. And I'm afraid I thought it was quite funny because I was quite little at the time. And it happened again when I was a bit older. And we were given advice specifically after he got hepatitis B about that particular infection, but we weren't given general advice about infections or anything that could happen with the blood. But anecdotally, from friends who are also haemophiliacs, there was just this vague idea that you might get something, and a vague idea that it would probably usually be Hep B or something like that. But
now, when your dad was told his diagnosis in or around 1986 at St Thomas's, what information or advice about his condition was given to him?
All I remember from this time was the information that we were given was all about protecting ourselves from Dad. It was about the risk that he might present to us. At the time, I don't know if anyone remembers back this far, they first of all thought that only 1 in 10 people with HIV were going to develop full-blown AIDS. I think they were saying it was 3 or 4 out of 10 at the point we found out my dad was HIV positive, and about 7 out of 10 at the point that he died. So we almost thought we're managing a potential condition, not something that was definitely going to happen. And everything we're told, separate laundry, separate plates, washing up separately, all that kind of thing, was supposedly to prevent Dad from transmitting HIV to us.
And what you've said in your statement, Ms. Kay, is Mr. Savage, the consultant, advised that your dad should use protection when having sexual relations, to use and wash his sheets separately, to use separate utensils and wash them in boiling water, not to take suits to the dry cleaners, and he was warned of the risk of passing the infection on with blood-to-blood contact. And then you've said this: there was far more information about how not to infect others than about how to keep yourself safe and well.
Yes, that was exactly it. I mean, everything was about how to keep us apparently safe from Dad. And it seemed very strange and upside down.
Now, what, if any, advice was given to you and your mum about the need to be tested?
My mum was advised that she would need to be tested and that the tests would need to be repeated 6 monthly intervals. And I didn't see any need for me to be tested. I used to be asked quite regularly if I'd had needle stick injuries when I went to hospital with Dad. And I think it's slightly different from working in a hospital than when you're actually looking after a member of your own family. You tend not to get needle stick injuries, and I just never had one. And they still insisted that I was tested.
And what can you recall of that experience?
It was not particularly pleasant. I'm still completely phobic about blood tests, and I struggle being close to needles at all. Because I couldn't see a reason why I could possibly have HIV, because I'd not had a needle stick injury, And by this point, I'd done a lot of research into the other transmission methods, and I just thought they were suggesting something that was... I was just thinking, how would I have got it? What would I have done? And I was trying to work out what they were implying by that, and I got very upset about it because I just thought, well, how would I have got it? And went to the hospital and had to be tested, and I was really, really not wanting to be tested, and I basically got restrained.
And you were 14 years old? What about the testing of your mum? What was the effect on your mum of having to be tested for HIV?
My mum was nervous and cautious of doctors and the medical profession anyway, because she had contracted polio when there was an issue with a water treatment plant in Oxford. I think it was 1956, and because she was wheelchair bound, she felt very vulnerable, and she was just terrified, and she had been through a lot with becoming disabled with polio about the time she hit puberty, and she became very angry, very depressed, alternately just very vocal and very withdrawn.
And she was particularly fearful because in the 2-year period that you've mentioned, she and your dad had had unprotected sexual relations.
Exactly, and we both tried very hard, but I think Mum was actually angry at Dad, even though he didn't know. She was very frightened for herself, and there was just so much fear at the time. And the newspaper stories that I remember were just saying that people would just bleed to death from every orifice, and it was just absolutely terrifying.
Indeed, you've said in your statement that in terms of the immediate impact on you of being told your dad's diagnosis was you believed Dad was going to die of the plague.
Well, that's what it was. It was just the plague. That was how HIV and AIDS were described in the media, and that was the information that we had to hand.
How did your dad react to the diagnosis? What was the impact upon him mentally and emotionally?
My dad was very, very sociable, and he was very strong, and he always tried very hard to remain calm and compassionate. And because I know different now, but what we all thought at the time was that this was something accidental, that it wasn't something preventable. And I think my dad put on a very strong face for us, but he was obviously very badly affected. Because he had haemophilia, my parents have struggled to get mortgages, and because of my mum being disabled as well, and they both experienced quite a lot of discrimination because of their disabilities, because things were different in the 1970s and 80s. And my dad had made a very, very big deal of putting lots of money into different savings plans and insurances and making sure that if anything ever did happen to him, that we'd always be provided for. And when he found out he was HIV positive, it was at about the time that a lot of the insurance companies, loan companies and mortgage providers were saying that they would just not pay out for anyone even if they'd just had a test, regardless of the result. And we were all just very afraid. My dad tried very, very hard to be strong, and he always tried to explain things in a very reasoned and calm way to me. But there was a lot of fear. We were just very, very scared all the time.
And you've said that, again, at this early stage after the diagnosis, in terms of your mother, it gave rise to terrible issues for her around loving your dad. She had a physical fear of the possibility of becoming infected.
Exactly. And because Mum had been through so much already, neither of us knew how to cope with this. And my mum, the first person she had turned to when she was frightened or upset was my dad. And she wanted physical comfort. And yet she'd been told she shouldn't have that. And, sorry, I find this really hard to talk about. Obviously, I was a teenager at the time. We're talking about my parents and sex. So it's a little bit embarrassing. Please excuse me. It did cause problems. As I said, my mum would be alternately very loud and angry and withdrawing. And then she would try and be normal towards my dad. And none of us knew how we were supposed to behave because, you know, he was my dad, Mum's husband, and we both loved him. And we were afraid that he was going to become very unwell, possibly die, and we wanted to look after him and we wanted to comfort him, but at the same time we were being told that he was dangerous and we didn't know what to do. You don't know how you're supposed to reconcile the fact that you love someone and want to look after them, but that you've been told that they could kill you.
Your dad's physical health began to decline. And you've described how by September of 1987 he had full-blown AIDS.
It wasn't actually officially described as such by then. What happened in September 1987 was that he started to get the flu. And we knew by then that the flu was the start of full-blown, but it had to carry on for some time. I can't remember what it was actually called, but my dad had this flu that lasted several months, and it was a really, really awful, debilitating flu. I've had pneumonia since, and it was incredibly mild compared to this flu my dad had. And it just made him incredibly weak. And we're all very frightened because we realised that was going to be the start of what full-blown AIDS was. Because that's what we've been told would happen. He would have a flu that would last a long time, and that would be the start of it.
And he'd been a tall, strong man, and his body weight reduced drastically. And you've said he became skinny and weak and out of breath, almost like he had hepatitis B again, as he was quite yellowish.
He got a sort of pallor, a sort of yellowish grey pallor, that I've recognised in a lot of other people since. And my dad was 6'6", obviously very big, strong guy, and it looked as though he was just shrinking before our eyes. And he'd always tried to keep himself as fit as possible, and his muscles just completely wasted away. I took a photograph when we went for a walk. I don't remember exactly where, somewhere in Surrey. And we got the photos developed, and my dad tore up and threw away a photo of him because he was wearing a sleeveless top and his arms were so skinny. And he just couldn't bear to look at it.
What happened on Boxing Day 1987?
It's somewhere between the start of the flu. I was told the start of the flu was sort of full-blown, but then I've also been told that Boxing Day was the day he officially went full-blown. So I don't know where exactly the definition lies, but I woke up on Boxing Day and my mum was screaming, and she just wouldn't stop screaming. And I went into my parents' room and I was obviously quite worried about what was happening. And because my mum had paralysed legs and could fall out of bed, one side of the bed was against the wall and that was the side my mum slept on. And my dad was on the other side. And my dad was just incredibly ill, pale, waxy, sweating, unable to move, and didn't really seem to be responsive when I was trying to talk to him, and my mum was trapped in the bed. And we just didn't know quite what to do.
So you called an ambulance?
Yes.
And what then happened? I can take it from your statement if that would be easier. So you phoned the hospital and asked, you called the ambulance, but they refused to attend when your mother explained what the medical condition was. And so you phoned St Thomas's and asked them to send an ambulance, but it was some 4 hours before an ambulance arrived. Your dad was then taken to A&E. And what happens, if you feel able to say it, I can take it from your statement otherwise, so please don't worry if you can't. How was he cared for in those first few days in hospital?
He wasn't. He was left on a gurney in a little side corridor in an A&E.
You've said in your statement, Miss Kay, that you remember your dad being hungry and thirsty, struggling for breath, getting bruises from the trolley because it wasn't a proper bed.
Yeah.
After a couple of days, he began to receive treatment and to recover a little. But then his condition deteriorated again.
Yes, it did.
Now, the following months, as I understand it from your statement, your dad would recover a little, get worse again. He managed to go back to work for periods of time, but then he'd become too ill.
Yes, that's right. The first infection he had, we're told it was pneumocystis pneumonia. And he had several different treatments. Had one treatment that seemed to work, and then he got sick again, and eventually we ended up with something being flown over from America that we had to sign off for. We had to sign some form saying that if all his organs failed and he died as a side effect, that we wouldn't sue the company. I don't even remember the name of the company that made the drugs.
And your mum was too upset to sign that document. Your dad was too ill, so you signed it.
Yes.
And what you've said in your statement, we had a dozen or so days when we left Dad seeming well and improving in the hospital, only to find he was on the critical list and there were messages on the answer phone by the time we got home.
Yes.
And it was some months before your dad, in fact, was well enough to come home. And by that time, he was physically unsteady, had lost more weight, and was having breathing difficulties.
He was very, very frail, and when he did come home, he was sleeping, sitting upright on a sofa in the living room.
Now, he did go back to work, but then developed another infection.
Yes.
And you've described in your statement how he was at a meeting at work, began to feel unwell, and had to go to the hospital and was told that he had a huge bleed into his kidney.
Yes, that's right.
And there was a lack of clarity as to whether that was a problem caused by his haemophilia or AIDS related, but it was then established it was AIDS related.
Yes.
Was your dad in pain at this time?
He never said he was in pain, and he never complained of pain, but he showed a lot of symptoms of pain. He never liked complaining of being in any pain or discomfort because he didn't want to worry Mum or I, and that went back as far back as I could remember, way before he had HIV. And he was often appearing to be, well, he was conscious but not quite there, and he often had the shakes or would be very hot or very cold, and I think that was because he was in a lot of pain and trying to deal with it without saying very much.
And you put it this way in your statement: every time Dad got an infection and survived it, it was as though I got my dad back, but another part of him didn't work.
Yes, that's exactly how it felt, that he was gradually disappearing piece by piece.
And then there came a point in time in 1988, he had a range of health problems you've described in your statement. He had internal bleeds, he had the pneumonia you've referred to, he had tooth problems, he lost feeling in his hands and feet, his eyesight started going and his organs started giving up. And he got sicker and sicker in hospital.
Yes.
Your dad died in October 1988.
Yes.
How old was he at the time?
He was 44.
And how old were you?
17.
In terms of the care he received before his death, you've described the delay in waiting for an ambulance and the care on that initial admission to A&E. Were there any other difficulties that he had accessing treatment during this period?
We were quite worried about leaving him on his own because the nurses and other staff weren't really washing him, cleaning his teeth. He was having difficulty getting food and drink. And we were very worried that he wasn't being looked after properly. His sheets didn't seem to be changed. And we think this was because he had AIDS. The nursing staff appeared to be quite dismissive and scared of him.
In the last 4 to 5 weeks of his life, he was receiving AZT treatment. And what was that like?
It was incredibly depleting. At the time, we were told it was this new wonder drug that would keep Dad well and keep him safe, but he needed blood transfusions, he needed these things called supervitamins, and AZT seemed to make him anemic. It made him lose even more weight, and there was hardly anything left of him, and it just made him really, really sick.
What was the experience that you and your mum had after his death when you attended the registrar's office to report his death?
My mum had been trying to avoid getting AIDS put on my dad's death certificate. My dad thought it was important that his death would be recorded as being from AIDS. At the time my dad died, it was a notifiable disease. I don't know if it still is, actually. And we had a very difficult time at the registrar's reporting his death.
Would you like me to read out that part of your statement?
Please.
You say this: the stigma did not end when Dad died. After his death, we attended the registrar's office to report Dad's death. We were kept waiting a long time, and other people in the office were staring at us. People spat at us, and the tyres on my mum's car were slashed whilst we were waiting.
Obviously, I can't say definitely that the car was vandalised because of what Dad had. We definitely thought so at the time. and there weren't any other vandalised cars in the vicinity. But I think what we felt then, and what I'm getting flashbacks to now, is a general feeling on behalf of the people at the registrar's office. It was just a mix of hate and fear. They just didn't want us to be there. They didn't want to deal with us. And they were afraid of us.
And in the period of time after your dad's diagnosis, before his death, you'd already lived with the effect of stigma, you and your mum and dad. You'd experienced it at school?
Yeah, I'd had a number of issues. It's not always possible to know how people find out things that you're trying not to tell anybody. But it did become known, and it caused a very big problem, which I tried to keep from my parents at the time because I didn't want to worry them. And they were going through so much already.
You've explained in your statement how you had to drop subjects or change classes because certain teachers wouldn't teach you, and you took months at a time off school, partly because of visiting and caring for your dad, but partly because the school was deciding whether it was safe to have you attend.
Yes.
And in terms of social and family life, your mum and dad, during this period of time, you'd stopped people coming to the house for fear that the news would get out, or that...
Yeah, we were worried that people would find out. Once Dad had this flu that had lasted so long, the colour of his skin, the weight loss, etc. It was how everybody described AIDS, and we were afraid that people would find out and they would cause us a problem, and there seemed to be... We're also afraid, obviously, going out to restaurants or something, because we've been told to keep Dad's plates and cutlery and things separate, and we're afraid about going away somewhere because what would we do about sheets being laundered? We sort of knew the science of the transmission. My mum and I had researched it, but at the same time what we'd been told officially was so much broader and so different that we didn't know if it would be manageable. And what if we went away and took precautions and someone found out? What would happen to us? What would happen if we were in a hotel miles away from anyone we knew and someone found out? Would they attack us? What would they do?
And you've said this, Ms. Kay, in your statement, it's really hard to explain the level of fear we felt. The stigma of HIV and AIDS at the time was very great. It felt like we had done something wrong, the worst thing, and that we didn't have a right to exist. My parents already had disabilities and had suffered with discrimination throughout their lives, but everything just amplified.
It did, and I'm sorry if I'm not being very clear or very coherent today.
You're being very clear, very coherent. If at any time you want me to take matters from your statement...
I'm just getting a lot of flashbacks as I'm speaking to you, and I'm finding it difficult to speak at the same time as I'm having the flashbacks, so apologies.
No need to apologise.
It's coming across very clearly to me.
Thank you.
Once your father had died, you weren't allowed to bury him. He had to be cremated.
He had to be cremated, and we had to produce a certificate showing that he had been cremated. We were given a list of appropriate funeral directors to use, and I can't remember where we had to take it. It was some official office. We had to take the certificate proving that he'd been cremated.
And you decided not to hold a funeral because you were so worried about what might happen if you did.
Exactly. And also, neither of my parents were religious.
In the period of your father's illness before his death, what had the impact been in terms of his ability to work overall and the financial impact on the family?
Obviously, Dad had a lot of time where he was extremely unwell and unable to work. He was very lucky that he was in a very senior managerial position and was sometimes able to work from home. The disadvantages of being anonymous, because I'd really like to thank a lot of the people he worked with who helped a lot, but a lot of his colleagues, a lot of his team, and most of his department and a lot of the HR team covered up a lot when Dad was away. And at the point that he died, it may have appeared in official records, though he'd never taken a day sick in the past 5 years.
Now, what was the impact of your dad's death and everything that had gone before it on your mum?
My mum completely, totally fell to pieces. She couldn't cope at all in any way, shape or form.
She suffered from depression. She ceased to be able to work.
She went through periods where she couldn't work. She could work sometimes. She had very long periods of time where she couldn't work. Something that happened at the same time as this, and I don't know if it's connected, because my mum had polio. Most people who got polio in the 1950s would die fairly soon afterwards, within 5 to 10 years. And because my mum had lived into middle age, they discovered around the time it happened to my mum that the virus reactivates in the body and can cause further disability, which is exactly what happened to my mum.
And you've explained in your statement how she became actively suicidal.
Yes.
You were attempting to care for her. You were attempting to stop her attempts at self-harm.
Yes.
And that carried on for a number of years.
It did, yes. Mum struggled very, very badly because she had had a lot of discrimination and felt that she had had a lack of medical support with what happened to her with polio. It brought everything back with what happened to Dad, because at the time my mum became wheelchair bound. Being in a wheelchair had a almost similar level of stigma, and I think it was just too much for her. She couldn't sleep. We had wooden floors because it was easier for her to wheel her wheelchair along, and she just used to wheel up and down the corridors all night, singing not a particular song, but just sort of la la la, just very strange. She used to set pans on the stove to burn out, and then because we had Pyrex pans, so she could see them when they're on the stove, they're the right, they were see-through for someone in a wheelchair, so they could still see. They would just explode on the hob in the middle of the night. And I would rush out to the kitchen to find out what had happened, and I'd walk straight through a load of broken glass.
9.5 years after your dad's death.
Yes.
Would you like me to say what happened to your mum? So 9.5 years after your dad's death, your mum succeeded in taking her own life.
Yeah.
Are you able to say what impact your dad's infection, death, and what subsequently happened to your mum has had on your life?
I was always slightly afraid of my mum and not so close to her because she could be very volatile and abusive, and she always has had been as I was growing up, and my dad was so sociable and friendly. He almost used to translate mum's behaviour for me, and I was incredibly, incredibly close to my dad. I mean, I used to treat him when he had bleeds and things, and when I went to school and learned to swim and learned to horse ride and play tennis and everything, I then went and taught him all these things because he was safe with me, because I could treat him if he had a bleed. And we had other family. My dad had an older brother who had 4 children himself, had 4 cousins. And because of my mum's behaviour, they'd never particularly got on that well with us. But after a couple of attempts on each side, they cut us off completely, and both my mum and I felt that it was because of what had happened to my dad. Either that they were afraid of the stigma, or they just couldn't cope with the stress and the reality of the situation. My uncle had already lost a brother. My uncle was about 15 years older than my dad, and there had been a middle brother called who'd died when he was a child, because it wasn't known that he was a haemophiliac, and he had a sudden and severe bleed and died. And so I think that might be why they couldn't cope. So once Dad died, it was just me and my mum on our own, and I promised Dad that I'd look after her. So every time she tried to hurt herself, even when her behaviour was very volatile and violent, I was trying to look after her and keep her safe. And I felt like I failed because she killed herself. And when she killed herself, she'd actually gone to a holiday home just outside. And I felt that I should have known, and that I should have been able to stop her. But at the same time, I just wanted her pain to go away, because she was always in so much pain. And I was also very close with my paternal grandmother. And after my dad died, she had a lot of guilt. I think she'd always had a lot of guilt and hadn't really spoken about it, because she didn't know that she was a carrier of haemophilia until her second son died. And then she first of all had to deal with my dad being a haemophiliac, and secondly, watching him get this awful disease and die. And we used to spend a lot of time talking about what I would now describe as survivor guilt, but I didn't know what to call it at the time. And I think the last time I spoke to my uncle, he phoned me up and asked me to stop speaking to my granny, because whatever I was saying was really upsetting her, and it wasn't on.
You've put it in your statement in this way, that your dad's infection and death cast a long shadow over your life. It impacted adversely on your ability to form relationships with others. You said you were scared of forming relationships, and there was a huge part of your life that defined you, which you couldn't tell anyone about. And you say you were a carer for the rest of your family till you were 30, and you had no dad, no finances, and later on no mum to help.
Yep, the rest of the family we're referring to there was actually my dad's mum, who I just mentioned, and about a year and a half after my dad died, my maternal grandmother died unexpectedly, and part of the effect on my mum of what happened to my dad was that she was, I mean, everyone's scared of death. She was absolutely petrified, and she was so afraid of having to run into people that she had known since childhood and just try and explain why Dad wasn't there anymore, that I ended up having to get in the car with her, and she drove away at 3:00 in the morning from my granddad's house to avoid going to her own mum's funeral. And my maternal grandfather was very, very intellectual chap, a former headmaster. And he outlived my mum by about 10 months. He never really, luckily I guess, he had become quite senile at the point where Mum was extremely volatile, and he was almost completely unaware by the point that she died. But he'd always found her behaviour very difficult to understand, and he didn't understand what had happened to my dad at all.
Was your dad, in that period of time between his being informed of his diagnosis and his death, ever offered any form of counselling or psychological support or assistance?
No.
What about your mum?
No. I believe it says in my statement that we weren't offered any counselling at all. I did remember through a flashback a couple of weeks ago that we were offered some counselling via the GP, and I think the reason I'd almost deliberately forgotten about it was that the counsellors turned up at our house and they sat down on our sofa drinking our tea and asked us what the problem was, and when we told them, they left. And we didn't feel that we could really talk to anybody very much after that.
In terms of financial assistance, you never received anything from any of the trusts and schemes, is that right?
That's right.
Your parents were part of a group action and received aid payments as a result of that group action, but that's
Yes.
all. There's an observation in your witness statement, Ms. Kay, about something a consultant told your father at an appointment. You said this: when I was 8, I attended an appointment with my father when the consultant told him to be grateful he was still alive, because if it wasn't for Factor VIII, he would have been dead 20 years earlier.
Yes.
And that was something that you feel strongly about, that attitude you've said in your statement.
The attitude, I think it's very hard to explain to somebody who hasn't had a chronic illness or been around someone with a chronic illness that requires frequent and or constant medical intervention. We used to go to the hospital a lot, Dad on his own and sometimes me with him, and because we were there so often, we felt that all the medical staff were almost our friends. We used to socialise with some of them, go out to dinner with particularly a couple of the staff from St Thomas's, and we trusted them. They were our friends, and it seemed like a very much more informal relationship than doctor-patient. So the implication and occasional statements that we should be grateful that Dad had lived that long, we should be grateful that he was alive, and that he would have died much earlier without Factor VIII treatment, all these things, plus the statement that you just read out for me, we just got used to hearing it, and it was just like, well, you have something in the blood, you get Hep B or whatever, it's just a small side effect of the treatment. And I remember when the news about AIDS first hit, when I first read about it, and I asked my dad's consultant if he could go back to splinting, which is what he had done before getting Factor VIII. And I was told that once a patient had Factor VIII, they couldn't go back to splinting, and that splinting wasn't very effective anyway. And it just seemed that everything I remember as a child was that Factor 8 was this wonderful treatment. It was this wonder treatment that meant that people could lead normal lives and have a longer life expectancy than anything that had come before. And therefore, anything that came with it was just something that you had to accept.
You've continued, even to the present day, to experience a degree of stigma in consequence of what your dad went through.
Yes.
How's that affected you?
I struggle on a few different sides. I think in common with everyone else who's given evidence and everyone who's affected and infected, it is medical treatment and medical staff who have caused the problem. And though I appreciate this may be accidental on the individual's behalf, it's very difficult when a large number of staff, or it seems as though it's the whole of the medical establishment, has caused a problem. And then when you want to get treatment, you have to go back to the medical establishment. And you have to trust doctors again. And I've had issues fairly recently with an operation I was due to have last September, in terms of a surgeon telling me verbally on the phone that there was an issue with safety to her team in operating on me, which I didn't understand, and then being told something different in writing. I've had, when it's come up in the past, in fact, there's a letter from my legal team that arrived at my shared house one day last year, and because it had, I can't remember if it had a legal team's name on it or whatever, but my landlady opened it because she was curious. And when she read that I was involved in this inquiry, I came home and found that my belongings were by the front door and the locks had been changed. And there have been instances where I've trusted people who I've had friendships or relationships with, and when I trust them enough to actually explain what happened with my dad, then they stop speaking to me. I've had issues at work. And sorry, I find this very difficult to talk about because...
You've answered the question very clearly, and we have your statement, your written statement, as a matter of record. Ms. Kay, that's the end of the questions I wanted to ask for you. Is there something that you would like to say or add?
I would like to make 4 points, if that's okay. And I'm just going to read from my notepad. The first point is we need qualified psychologist support. We've all been stigmatised, traumatised, and had to bury things that have happened to us. Now we are reliving these events through our own accounts and other people's. We are prime candidates for SPTSD, and we need specialised support. At the same time, we have amazing peer support networks online, and I think it may also be appropriate to train some people involved as peer counsellors. These wonderful people are offering support anyway and need training to support others and protect themselves. Secondly, in the 1980s, AIDS and Hep C were a gift to those who wanted to further stigmatise and marginalise the high-risk groups, such as gay men, sex workers and IV drug users. This, along with insurers and mortgage providers' policies at the time, refusing loans or cover to those who'd even been tested, drove high-risk groups underground. They were untested, victims of hate crimes, and many people in these groups felt as though they were already damned, so they had nothing else to lose. Stigma, legal and financial consequences prevented people from being tested, further increasing the risk to everyone in society, especially those receiving blood products or whole blood. Haemophiliacs and whole blood infection victims have been seen as worthier than these groups. My dad didn't blame gay men, sex workers or IV drug users, and neither do I. It's not your fault. Thirdly, many people also believe that infected blood is an old issue and irrelevant. Without wishing to scare anyone, there is always a new blood-borne virus. I'm tracking 5 at the moment. Although a lot has changed in medical practice in the last 30 years or so, we need to ensure that high-risk groups, infection testing and seeking treatment are not stigmatised when the next infection is here. And finally, a huge thank you to everyone who has supported me and anyone else infected or affected. And thank you to all participants, who are probably all better speakers than me. And please remember those still affected by poverty, trauma and stigma who feel unable to participate. We still respect and support you. And we are here if you feel that you can join us.
Ms. Kay, I'm just going to ask Mr. Locke, who, as you know, represents you for something else. No. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very powerful account. And despite what you may have thought, very clearly put over.
Thank you.
Now that concludes the proceedings for today. Tomorrow, 10:30 start. Can you tell us what's in store?
Certainly, sir. We have 3 witnesses tomorrow, Irene Spellman, Adrian Goodyear and Sue Gorman.
Well, I shall look forward to hearing their testimony. Thank you very much. 10:30.